This video is all about the history of the council house. The building of council houses mainly started to get underway after 1919, under David Lloyd George's government, with the production of the Addison Act. Since then, many houses and flats were built. Council estates, which consisted of many homes with local shops and amenities, started to flourish all around the UK. But since the 1980s, there has been a mass decline in availability, and many people ask the question, just what went so wrong with the council house? But before this, I would be interested in finding out what life was like for many working class and poor people before the council house. During the 19th century, many cities began to expand due to the Industrial Revolution, so many extra workers were needed. At this time, travel was cumbersome and expensive, not to mention unreliable, so people began to flock to where the work was, mainly in London, Glasgow, Liverpool and Newcastle. In this period, the building of homes were down to the private enterprises, who built streets with no forward planning, erecting long, narrow streets and bad lighting, and homes without water, shared kitchens and shared toilets outside. There were mostly rooms in boarding houses for accommodations for single men, who not only had to share their rooms, toilets, washing facilities, but also had to share their beds on a shift basis. The streets were becoming cramped. Cities were becoming overshadowed with bad sanitation, grubby streets, and diseases were threatening to spread. All working class and poor people could not afford homes as mortgages were scarce, and the availability of mortgages was for the rich. In fear of illness spreading to the wealthy, they themselves began to petition for the government to get involved in building homes for the new influx of people. The government, at this time led by David George Lord, began to listen, and in 1919 the Addison Act was passed. Before the Addison Act, though, the most important move was in 1890, with Homes for Working Class People Act. This was to ensure improvements were made to existing homes and to clean up boarding houses and shared accommodation. Some voluntary organisations and charities made home for the poorest of families, and mostly private landlords were still responsible for most of the rented properties in large towns and cities. However, they still demanded high rents for improved, but still basic buildings. Local councils did at this time have the power to build houses, but most did not get involved. Indeed, some estates did start to get built, but they were replacing the slums, so the new homes were set to rehouse those who had been displaced by the demolitions. Two problems arose here. The slums were dense and housed far more people than the new buildings could accommodate. The second problem was that the poorest of folk who were set to come back to these areas could not afford the new rents, so migrated to slums that they could afford. This meant that even more crowding in unmodernised areas. I think there was a story where about 3,000 people were moved out of an area, and by the time they rebuilt the estate, only about 30 people were able to come back. Not very fair. Up until 1919, rents were set by the request of landlords and councils, to which they had no subsidiaries from the government. New homes were built to higher standards than before, with thicker walls, better lighting and in less dense areas, which would demand a higher rent without any help from subsidisation. The poor loses out again. An example of better housing can be seen today in Millbank and Westminster in London. Built in 1902, it was to accommodate over 4,000 people. The estate was built after the demolition of the infamous Millbank prison. The Tudor Walters Report. Tudor Walters' report was submitted to the government in 1912. Raymond Unwin suggested a new garden city where people should be given dignity, not only in their homes, but around their homes. He envisaged a minimum size for rooms and a garden around the house for tenants to enjoy and be proud of their homes, thus taking care and keeping them to a higher standard. His suggestions included 2 living rooms, one for the family and the other an occasional room for adults entertaining, or to give quiet to a member of the household who may become ill or simply want to be alone. A minimum of 3 bedrooms, remember families were a lot bigger in them days. He also proposed a scullery, a larder and a bathroom, But the most important part of his recommendations were to see that there was ample light and airflow throughout the house and ample room around the houses, so the streets had room to breathe. This must have been a luxury for those who lived in squalor all those years. Back then, though, inspectors would visit to ensure that homes were being well kept. They looked at curtains, gardens, and even the front door to ensure that these homes were being respected by their dwellers. The new rent books came with new rule books for people to abide by, else face penalties or even evictions. This was still at the time when social housing was given to those who were higher working class and still out of reach of the very poor. I remember as a child my grandmother telling me that the carpets could not reach the walls, that there had to be an island gap all around, so any contractors that came in would have to walk along the bare floorboards, and this would stop them from treading any mud onto the carpets. It's just one of the rules back in them days. After the First World War and the Addison Act. I've mentioned this act a few times, so here it is and what difference it made to social housing. Named after its author, Dr. Christopher Addison, the name of the act was actually called the Housing and Town Planning Bill. After the First World War, there was a massive need for housing, so there was an ambitious plan to build 500,000 homes in 3 years. However, less than half were actually built due to budget cuts and poorer economy in the 1920s. 213 were actually built, but it wasn't a bad effort. The Act made rented accommodation and home building a national scheme, which involved all local authorities being directed by government to provide housing as a reward for homecoming war soldiers and their families. Mainly higher working class people were able to afford rents, so it still wasn't a fix for the poor. Further acts pushed councils to provide homes as a social service. In 1924, another act to build more homes, and another act in 1930 obliged the council to get rid of all remaining slums and build over 700,000 homes. So from 1919 to 1935, over 1.1 million new homes were built. The councils got delivered another act in 1937 to ensure that playgrounds, sporting facilities and recreational grounds were also placed within the reach of these new estates. That was a lot of work for the councils. The largest estate built in this period was the Becontree estate in East London. 27,000 homes were built. Mind you, it did take 15 years. Rent in the 1920s was around £2 a week. Today's money of 2025 works out about 114 quid. Compare this to today's social housing rents. In the Midlands, a rented 3-bedroom house from the council would cost you £127. In the south, for a 3-bed, it set you back £173. So not that much difference when you compare. But it does show how cost of council houses back then, their rents were extremely high. Privately, just interestingly, a 3-bedroom in the Midlands costs you about £1,000 a month. London, private renting for a 3-bed, about £3,000 a month. Probably more expensive in such areas such as Kensington and Notting Hill. It wasn't until 1930 when homes were built in the outer city areas that rents became more affordable to all classes of people. Estates were built on the fringes where people had to travel longer to get to work. The Art Deco style houses were built on the fringes of London and inspired extensions to the London Underground network. Example, trains to Uxbridge, Rayners Lane, Cockfosters, and that's just on the Piccadilly line. There's some fantastic examples though. Rules of housekeeping were even stricter and letters of cleanliness were sent to tenants. Here is an example of such a letter. Dear Sirs, the Housing Committee realised that you have been living under very undesirable conditions and that in worn-out houses it was very difficult to get rid of vermin, but there will be no excuse in your new home. Do not buy second-hand furniture, bedding, pictures, unless you are quite sure that the articles are free from vermin. Insects do not like soap and hot water, and they also dislike dusters and polish. So if in your new house you keep your windows open, keep your bodies and your clothing and your floors and your stairs and your carpet and your bedding clean, use the duster frequently on all skirting and ledges, you are not likely to be troubled with them again. This sounds a lot, but life isn't going to be all work for the housewife. The new house will be easy to clean and it will be well worth looking after. Then came the Second World War. This put a stop to house building on account of materials were needed for the war effort, plus the lack of manpower owing to workers being restricted to special services such as munitions, transport and essential farm work, and nursing, doctors, etc. So for the second time, housing needs became a crisis due to bombs destroying most of the stock. Under a new Labour government by Clement Attlee, it was reported that over 750,000 homes were needed. A short-term solution was to build prefabricated houses, many bungalows which could be factory-made and erected quickly. These were estimated to last for about 10 years, but they did last a lot longer in reality. In fact, some not only stand today, but they are still being lived in. Constructions were basic, but they had plenty of light and storage, plus heating and indoor toilets. They were built in factories where aircraft had once been constructed during the war. Also, prisoners of war, who still remained in the UK, helped construct them. Over 150,000 were built in 1947, but there was still a major shortage. Still prefabricated, more houses were built using concrete blocks bolted to metal frames, rather like the ones you see in high-rise flats that were built in the 1960s. They were efficient to build and required less skill. They were estimated to last for over 60 years. This did alleviate the urgent need for housing, as the number of families living in social houses had increased from 10% in 1938 to a quarter of the population in 1945. Demand was still getting higher. Interestingly, around 17% of people in the UK live in social housing today, but this is split between council-owned properties and housing associations. Probably less than 10% are council tenants as of 2025. But the population figures in 1945 after the war were just below 30 million, compared to today's figure of 69 million. And here's a little fact I discovered, that in 1066 there were only 2.5 million people living in the UK.
The Second World War had come to an end, and a radical change was needed. A new urban vision was on the horizon. The 1930 Act of getting rid of all the old slums had been set aside due to the war. These places had become even more neglected, and families living in one-bedroom, damp and cold derelicts and back-to-back houses, and some even still sharing outside toilets. There was a massive depletion of stock due to bomb damage, so it was time, with the influx of even more people flocking to the cities and towns, for something brand new. Major changes took place. We had a new Conservative government in 1951, with Churchill back in the seat, and it pledged to build a new vision, giving housing building stock back to the private sector. However, damaged homes and slum streets could be bought by the council by means of a compulsory order in the inner cities to rebuild Britain. This was met in many rundown areas with protests from residents from the slum communities. They wanted to keep their own way of life, their families and their friends around them. The vision they despised was the pioneering Cities in the Skies reform. Many folks held sit-ins and mobbed the contractors who believed they were not only pulling down their homes, but they were pulling their lives apart. But this came to no avail. The slums would be gone forever. Mostly, particularly the younger people, welcomed the new embark on bright new homes, kitted with communal play facilities, shops, schools and playgrounds, with heating and hot water at the turn of a tap or a control switch. It was a better life for them. It wasn't long before people began to feel isolated in these new 6-story blocks. The community spirit had started to diminish, particularly those living on the upper floors and living alone. The concrete jungles, as they were then called, were seen as hideous and would soon be an easy target for crime. This was at the time a solution for masses of people needing homes. More high-rise flats began to be erected in the 1960s, quite densely packed, and together forming concrete communities. However, broken lifts, darkly lit alleyways, and the lack of community centres, plus little for the kids and the teenagers to do, soon led to an insurgence of petty incidents of crime, and families could not wait to get out. Problems became worse in the 1970s, with the lack of investment and the realisation of how poorly these blocks were built. Missing bolts, poor window frames, and the lack of modernisation made a poor standard of living, and it was not long before these areas became a no-go zone for many people, including postal staff and taxi services. They became hard to let, so hard in fact that the council started to let them to problem people, thus escalating bad reports. The tower blocks became dingy and badly managed. Cracks clearly appeared in this great architectural idea. More than 500,000 flats were made available in London alone. Britain's skyline had changed for a short time for the better, but as the decades went by, they were getting demolished, and they left a bad memory for many former residents. Rewinding back to the late 1940s, the government could see that building in cities alone was never going to be enough to house everyone that needed a place to live. It was time to build a new suburban community, and brand new towns were needed. Under the New Towns Act of 1946, there were 3 waves of new towns built to deal with the overspill of the cramped cities. They would have their own places of worship, community centres and doctors, and even shopping centres. The councils didn't want the new residents to crowd the cities for their daily needs, so it was important that full local amenities were made available, albeit that did tail behind the new buildings. The first wave of independent new towns was intended to help alleviate the housing shortages beyond the green belt around London. 2 sites in County Durham were also designated, and these designations included Stevenage, Crawley, Hemel Hempstead, Harlow, Peterlee, Easington, Welwyn Garden City, Basildon, Bracknell, Corby. These were roomy, live, modern places and would cater for the middle-class working people who would feel at home and very comfortable. The second wave, 1962 to 1964, would be to alleviate cities in the Midlands, including Dorley Newtown, now known as Telford, and the North West. The third stage, up to 1970, would include Milton Keynes and Peterborough, just to name a few. For the majority of towns, it was still a success story. They were built for the population at the time, with plenty of green land and walk spaces such as parks and meeting areas. However, in the late 20th century, they saw the need for further building in these areas, giving up this land and open space. It has to be said, though, many people still think this is a desirable area to live. It's now the 1970s, and council houses were getting older and in more need of repair. Some estates became run down after the government had cut its funds for renovation and modernisation. There has been a change in the monitoring of residents, with the rule book almost being forgotten, and home visit inspections had practically ceased. The Labour government at the time, under James Callaghan, had discussed the selling of housing stock in order to save money on repairs, and with the view of people, if they owned their own homes, would take more pride and communities would improve. This, however, never came to fruition. Well, not yet anyway. Then, under Margaret Thatcher's government that took the chair in 1979, it was announced in 1980 there will be a new act, the right to buy. This meant, in certain circumstances, that council tenants could buy their own council home under the new law. Michael Heseltine had the idea that this would be a less burden on the state, as the new owners would be responsible for their own repairs, modernisations and insurance. Tenants, depending on how long they had rented the house or flat, could get a reduction on the sale price of up to 50%, or even 70% for flats. Nearly 1 million people took up the opportunity in the first 10 years, resulting in a great reduction of housing stock for the council. Some people actually got their homes for under £10,000, then sold them some years later for 10 times the price. This came with many problems for the councils. Some people who had bought their homes realised that they had structural problems. These were the concrete constructions with metal rods that rusted over the years, making the places hard to get a mortgage and almost impossible to resell. There were about 150,000 of these houses, and a file of complaint was made. In 1984, this petition was upheld and councils were forced to foot the bill for the repair or rebuild the houses from scratch. The other problems were that the wealthier people bought their homes in nicer areas, leaving the problem areas in the same position as before, and hardly any flats were bought. This did not play out the government's dream of relieving councils of the areas that they would rather do without. For the first time in a number of years, the building of council houses outweighed the need, and building became less and less. With the sale of many council houses and a massive depletion of houses, council house availability had declined. The problem was that with homes never built to replace those sold, as council budgets were slashed time and time again. In the 1980s, there were about 7 million homes run by the council. In the mid-1990s, they were down to about 4.4 million. As of 2025, there now stands only 2.2 million council places. That's a lot of rent that councils no longer collect. Governments have made massive pledges to build what they call affordable housing, but have failed targets and have always encouraged a homeowner Britain, as opposed to European countries who still have a larger rented population than homeowners. Targets have been missed due to planning permissions being turned down, councils on low budgets and greedy landowners asking too much for the land. So what about the future? The new Keir Starmer government is promising millions of homes and the waiving of some red tape. There are, according to the charity Shelter, as of 2025, 272,000 homeless people in the UK. This is a current housing crisis. Homelessness includes people on the streets or in emergency accommodations such as bed and breakfasts or sofa surfing. One of the main reasons for the problem is private tenancy contracts ending and no-fault evictions. It is shown statistically that over 350,000 people contacted their local authority in 2024 looking for support due to the threat of losing their home. Labour's big promise to build 1.5 million homes during the first term, just how realistic is this? There was also an announcement that the right to buy scheme for council residents will change, with the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, slashing the discount for new applicants. Incidentally, the current Housing Secretary, Angela Rayner, wants to be judged on her plan to ensure that council houses are built to ensure so all people can be housed, and not just cater for the private landlords and homeowners. It will be obvious that more houses will become available, the lower costs will be for buying and renting. But do landlords and landowners and sellers really want this? Labour has also made changes for the right to buy for councils, make it easier for them to buy social housing to rent out. Using the money for their sales, they will use that budget to purchase and build. Labour pledges to make a massive increase in the availability of social housing in the biggest, as they say, in a generation. Labour stated that processes will be sped up, cutting down on red tape, making planning permission easier, and using part of the green belt land for building. It's what they call the grey belt. People are already complaining about this. One of the main problems in the past is that protests have arisen when they have not wanted new builds in their area, spoiling their back garden views. Labour pledges to change the legislation to eradicate this. The problems are that many homes are built by large firms and they cannot be dictated by the government of how many houses they can build. They tend to build more when interest is low to ensure there is a quick take-up of new homes. But when interest is high, as it is now, they slow down. Remember, they are doing this as a business to maximise profits. Do you remember Barratt Homes? Yes, they are still around today and they are the UK's largest home builder. It's hard to believe that many sections of land already have planning permission to build. However, it's a policy of the larger building companies to land bank and have been accused of holding back on building in order to maximise profits. This is by waiting for the right prices to come along in the view of earning more money. Housing stock is mainly profited by dealing in second-hand homes, setting the price market, and vast amounts of new homes would knock down these prices. This would upset sellers and estate agents, not to mention private landlords having to revisit rent prices. Another promise foreseen by experts revealed that if this promise to build so many homes is carried out in a few years, then materials may become more scarce, and manufacturers could take advantage of the demand, and prices will soar. Private development is promised to increase with the rule of ensuring that a small amount of properties would be affordable. So-called affordable housing is 80% of the current selling market. In large towns and cities where prices are astronomical, this is surely out of the reach of most people. This mainly gives the investor the chance to snap up properties at a low price just to rent them out. So the pledge of home building is met with doubt by many experts and forecasters. The current government, of course, will reply with their repeated comment, "This was the mess left by the previous administration over previous years." Well, let's not deviate and look at the reality of the massive home building promise. Have we been groomed to believe that we have to own our home? Has it been allowed private renting to spiral out of affordability? One thing is for sure, our ageing population is ever growing, and more people are needing a place to live. Finally, dare I mention migration? This is something that is a major argument for politicians, particularly Nigel Farage. He stated that in the last 20 years that the population had increased by over 10 million people. That depletes the availability of housing. This has been debated in the petition for a general election signed by over 3 million people, and his major argument is against the new Labour government doing very little for social housing.